Good morning, how are you? Good. I too would like to honour the traditional owners of this land, and I'd also like to honour each and every one of you for the difference that you make, and I mean that, each and every one of you, for the difference that you make for the men and boys and for the fathers and families in your lives. I don't need to know you to know that you make a difference. People who don't make a difference don't come and sit in rooms like this to have conversations like this. So thank you for the difference that you make. And you know, when you're in something, you don't always know how great it is. And I just want to really honour the men's movement in Australia, which, and I'm fairly expert in this, which as far as I can see is the strongest, most connected, most dynamic and relevant men's movement anywhere in the world. And I really want you to just take that in, because I know you'll all face struggles, and I know you'll find it difficult, and I know you'll all be aware of how much better it could be and how much more you could do. But I also want you to be able to stop and hear it from me as an outsider, that this is, I promise you, the strongest, most dynamic, most exciting men's movement anywhere in the world. And you can change the world by acting local and thinking global. And you do think global, which is why here, me, an Englishman, and Warren, an American, are standing and sitting, speaking to you today. So thank you for all that you do, because it inspires us in the work, certainly inspires me in the work that I do in the UK. I won't speak for anyone else, but it inspires me in the work that I do in the UK and my brothers in the UK. So thank you. So, bit of my background. I've been a father for 16 years, separated when my daughter was 2, so I was an at-home dad. I am a separated dad. I've been a stepdad for a while. I've had a stepmother in my daughter's life, so I get all the dynamics, most of the dynamics of, or many of the dynamics of family life. We know there's many more, right? And I sort of got interested in sort of father work. Well, I suppose I got interested in father work as an at-home dad. I lived in what was supposed to be the most politically correct borough in the whole of the UK, the London borough of Hackney, the type of place that the right-wing press would say they're not allowed to use black bin bags in that borough because it's politically incorrect and all this kind of crazy stuff. And I was really blown away at just how invisible men were when I became a father in 1997. You know, there were mothers and toddlers groups. I would go to the official health services with my daughter, and I would be the only father there, and there'd be notices saying, "Mothers, when you bring your babies here." I had an ongoing battle with my local swimming baths about the mother and toddler baby session, swimming session. And they said, "Well, you can come." I said, "Well, why are you calling it the mother and toddler session? It should be the parent and toddler session." So I used to have all this sort of craziness going on. It was my first sort of emergence of being political. 99% of the time I was just being a dad, but I kept saying these little things that really annoyed me. And then I did a bit of writing about being a dad, did some writing about being a dad for magazines in the 90s, and I wrote for an emerging website called Fathers Direct, which about my experience of being a father, which went on to become the Fatherhood Institute. So I got that sort of connection with the sort of the policy level of work in the UK. And you'll be aware of the Fatherhood Institute, I'm assuming, because you've had many speakers from that organisation, and David Bartlett has been here this week. And then I became a separated father, and after a couple of years of making separation work, I thought this system around separated fathers really doesn't work, and I want other dads to know about that. And I went out looking for what was out there and stumbled across a small organisation that was just starting campaigning called Fathers for Justice, and got involved in 2 years in direct action campaigning and lobbying for change and all that kind of stuff, which was great fun. Met a lot of politicians, learnt an awful lot, but I could see quite quickly that it wasn't the whole answer. That, you know, just working on changing law wasn't really actually making a huge difference for fathers of all backgrounds. So I got interested in, well, what's the bigger picture? And I'm a big thinker. I don't like small problems, I like big problems. I once heard someone say, if you want to disappear a problem in your life, get yourself a bigger problem. And it really works, yeah? So I kept trying to make this problem bigger and bigger in my head. It's not just separated fathers, it's all fathers. But then it's not just fathers, this is about men. And it's not just men in my area, it's about men in my country. But then, it's not just about men in my country, it's about men all over the world. And it's not just about men, it's about boys. It's about, oh my goodness, this is big. This is 3.5 billion people, blimey. So it's a problem that I avoided for a very long time because it was so damn big. But at some point, about 4 years ago, I went, I've got one life and I've got a difference to make in the world. So I'm going to take on seeing what it's going to take to make a difference for all men and boys around the world, which is a big ambition. And to look at every problem that men and boys face from cradle to grave. And the theory was that if we set up a small local organisation, which is in my city in Brighton and Hove, which is 50 miles south of London on the sea, a population of about 250,000 people, quite diverse, some very poor areas, some rich areas, a little bit of cultural diversity, so certainly a lot of sexual diversity, big LGBT community, and quite political diversity as well. You get sort of the left and the right and the Greens all in the same city. So a very interesting city with lots of diverse and different problems. And what we thought was because I'd initially thought about setting up a national think tank that looked at sort of all issues as a think tank, but I thought, wouldn't it be much more interesting if we're actually on the grassroots, at the grassroots with real men and boys, finding out what they really need, and then to connect that to what else is happening in the world already, what's happening at a national level and what's happening at an international level. Because my belief was that any problem that men and boys are facing anywhere in the world, and fathers are facing anywhere in the world, someone out there is an expert at resolving it, and we just don't know them yet. I was just having a conversation with Simon about 5 minutes ago, going, oh my God, that guy knows so much. I've been looking for that guy because there's a piece of the jigsaw puzzle that he's got that I've been missing for ages. And that's what this thing about, for me, for building a sort of an informal and loose network really does. You find expertise in it. So I'm about creating a network, a context around work for men and work for fathers and the difference that can make. And that's why I've ended up here, because some of the best work in the world is being done here. So I get to see it, and I can import some of the ideas back to my country, and we can share the knowledge between us. We're an international brotherhood as far as I'm concerned. But I'm going to talk about the piece of the jigsaw that we took on locally in terms of fathers. It's an incomplete, it's not an evaluated piece of work, it's a lot of vision. What I do is I'm a visionary, and I don't mean that in an arrogant way, I mean it's a skill, actually something that we all have from birth, but then we tend to lose from the age of 7 onwards. And I think being visionary is important. Being up in the clouds all the time doesn't help, it's a bit la-la, but if we can combine being visionary with actually being rational and actually taking action, that's really helpful. So when I say I'm a visionary, I just ask questions that open up thinking about what's possible. And so the question that I ask around fatherhood is, what does it take to create a father-friendly city? And I'd like you to sit with that question, or community, right? So I'd like you to sit with that question for the duration of this talk and make it relevant to you. I'll make it the male-friendly community if it's more relevant to you. So what will it take to create a really father-friendly community to wrap around the work that you do? So that's the question that I've been living inside in terms of the father's work that I do at a local level. So even when I'm just working with a guy one-to-one, I'm also thinking, how does this fit into the bigger picture, and how could we have actually done a better job for this guy if we had a father-friendly community? So, firstly, father-unfriendly communities. Just one story, just because it's one of the most recent ones from the UK. This guy's called Aftab Khan, and that's his son. They live in the Yorkshire city of, I think it's Bradford, in Yorkshire in England, and that's them on the way to court. And this is just a couple of months ago. So basically, Aftab Khan has 8 children, and his eldest are about 24, I think now, and the youngest was 4. So there's a range of 8 children, 2 adults, 6 at home. So 24 years of parenting going on there, okay? And then the only real serious intervention that the authorities, the system had with Mr. Khan was in about 2008 when there was a domestic violence incident, and he was charged with ABH, and he was removed from his children's lives, and that was the end of it. Now what comes out in court is that interview, where in that interview he's saying, you've got to go and see her. I tell you, she's crazy. You've got to go and see, at least, please, get a doctor to see the kid. You've got to just get a doctor to check him. She's not feeding him. She's mad. You've got to, and it comes out in court, right? It's ignored. Fast forward 2 years in 2010, and the youngest son, 4-year-old Hamza, is found in the basement, mummified, and he's been starved to death. He's been there for 2 years. And there are 5 other children in the house, aged 5 to 13. So, I mean, it's extreme, right? And I'm just showing it because it's an extreme case of the kind of thing that does happen if we don't have, not just father-friendly, but, you know, family-friendly and a support system, a safety system that works. So, I'll go into some nicer stuff, but it's just worth bearing in mind that the extreme end, if we don't get this stuff right, then that's the kind of extreme thing that can kind of happen. So I think fatherhood is quite interesting. You might say it's I sometimes say education's the father of all, the root of all kids' issues, but I think, you know, fatherhood could be argued to be at the root of all men's issues. You'll know this kind of stuff. I've got the statistics from the UK in my latest book, but just to refresh the mind, so the kids are more likely to do well at school. If they've got dad involved, less likely to be excluded from school, less likely to have mental health problems, less likely to die from suicide, less likely to commit crime, less likely to smoke, drink, and take drugs. So it has an impact on health. There's a lot of stuff that shows that father involvement has an impact on health later in life as a knock-on effect. Lower risk of teenage pregnancy, less likely to become homeless, less likely to become unemployed, and more likely to escape poverty. Obviously, these things affect boys and girls. I tend to focus on the impact on boys generally because I focus on the men and boys world. So we've been looking at the idea of what would it take to create a father-friendly community, and it's great to hear people over here. Andrew did a session on generative fathering the other day. We talk about the generative approach and how important that is. And I'm talking about a generative whole community approach. So not just a generative approach to when I work with this one dad here, but how do we create a context that actually just generates fathers like they pop up without any work whatsoever. And I assert that every dad, the one thing, no matter what dad's up to, that in there somewhere, that every dad wants to be the best dad they can be. And that's the seed that I'm looking for whenever I work with a father. However he's showing up, at the level of behavior, at the level of intention, I know in there is an intention to be the best dad he can be. Some principles of generative father work taken from, there's a website in the States which I list at the end, which is worth looking at if you're interested in more about the generative approach. But it's a lot about, you know, just making that assumption that dads actually are very capable. I was really taken by the talk by, is it Richard Aston from Big Buddy Scheme in New Zealand, where he was saying basically they connect mentors with fatherless boys, and basically saying we start from the principle that all men are good. And then we have a really rigorous screening process in place to make sure that no one gets through the filter, but we start from the principle that all men are good, and then we don't train them because they know how to have a relationship with young men and grow up young men. There's a wisdom that goes way back. So making that assumption that men are really capable at parenting is a really good starting point. So that's, you know, the generative or the assets-led approach rather than the deficit approach or the risk management approach. And it doesn't mean that you don't manage risk, right? It just means that in the background is the assumption. A couple more principles there. I'll just leave them there for a moment. And you can start to see as you look through this that some of this is not just about one-to-one, it's about culture. So, you know, engaging in respectful, accurate and constructive discourse about fathers and fathering. It's about what culture are we creating in our conversation about fathers. And some great stuff on that website there, fatherwork.byu.edu. So that's kind of the background context. The question is, how do we create a father-friendly community? using a generative approach. I use a model called the integral model. Lots of detail in it, but one of the most simple aspects of it is this quadrant. It's created by a guy called Ken Wilber, who's a close personal showbiz friend of Warren's. And they've done some interviews together, really worth listening to. I recommend that. But basically, it says if you want to get the full picture of any situation, small or large, you want to look at these 4 areas. There's the stuff that's going on internally on the left there, the stuff that's going on externally on the right there. The stuff across the top is the individual stuff. The stuff across the bottom is the collective stuff. And what tends to happen, I find, when we've worked with men, is that it's all when you sit down with a bunch of professionals and start talking about engaging with men, and you ask them where are the problems located, they start off and they're all located in the upper right-hand corner. Men do this, dads do that, dads do the other. And as you spend time working with people throughout the day, you start to go, oh, actually, there are some other stuff. The intentional stuff over on the left, which often isn't seen, is where I work. It's the intention to be the best father I possibly can. But also we look at what are the systemic barriers, and we look at what's going on culturally. And if we can be addressing all of that, then it becomes much easier to do work with men. It just becomes much easier to do work with anyone if you actually cover all those bases. Or at least have them in your awareness, right? So these are the questions you might want to ask when you start off. Is your community father-friendly? So do you relate to every dad as a great dad? Are there clear pathways to support dads? That's the sort of the external stuff. Is there somewhere they can go and follow some steps to get help? Have you considered what the systemic barriers are, and have you considered what the cultural barriers are? And it was a very, very simple model for father-friendly community. There's 3 levels of activity going on: the one-to-one work, what's happening at the community level, group level, and then the sort of the systemic strategic networks that wrap around that. If you go back to these, that's 1, 2, 3. If you go back to the quadrant, that's the I across the top, the we and the it's. The I, the individual one-to-one, the we, the community stuff, and the it's, the systemic networking stuff. So one-to-one stuff. So if I'm looking at how do we make our community the most father-friendly community going, I want to be aware of I want to map what's already out there. I want to really think about who are my partners and who's my team? I know I'm just doing my little project here, but who's my team in the city? Who's my team in this community? Who's already out there? Who's already out there doing one-to-one work, whatever that is, whether it's therapeutic, whether it's advocacy, whether it's sort of mentoring, whether it's just informal kind of connections. And I think what's interesting about this approach, what I've really tried to do is to be as inclusive as possible. And we talk a lot about inclusivity and diversity, but I find it often doesn't exist. It's like we're inclusive of a certain kind of approach. And I've really taken a stand in the UK to put people in a room who don't want to be with each other and make them be friends. I run a conference in the UK, not as big and as glamorous as yours, but very lovely and delightful. And at the last one we did at the end of September, one of the highlights for me was we've got, and I mix people from different perspectives, not just political perspectives, but also people who are campaigners and coming from a sort of a lobbying perspective, and people who are working at the grassroots. I like to mix them up. It's good to sort of get a sense of how we all fit together. Right? And one of my favourite moments for me was we've got this sort of right-wing anti-feminist political party that's trying to stand in seats against the Conservatives at the next election, called Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them. And God bless him. I agree with him on all the issues he highlights and none of the interpretation of the problems or the solutions. And which is true of quite a lot of people, actually. And I looked over at one point, and there he is, the most right-wing anti-feminist man in the room, and he's standing next to the most Marxist pro-feminist man in the room, and they're chatting away, and they both looked over at me guiltily. And they sort of sided up to me afterwards and went, he's actually an all right bloke, actually, isn't he? Don't tell anyone I said that. Don't tell anyone we're friends. So I think what that points to is actually if we allow people to meet and know each other as men, from the heart, it enables us to cut through the kind of the barriers and clashes that occur when we relate to each other as our viewpoint or our perspective. I think that's really important. And one of the ways I do that is uniting people around vision, because I find at the level of vision, most people are united. Who wouldn't want to live in a really father-friendly city or a really, parent-friendly city? Who wouldn't want that? So then, this is, just to pull it out a bit, this is the context of all men's work. So when we took on not just doing fatherwork, but all men's work, and we tried to work out, well, how does it all fit together? And pretty much I find that most work, if you're trying to work out how to join the dots between people, how they connect. So I find that most work with men will fall into one of those 4 quadrants. And I link people, like I said, I link people around vision. So when I talk about fathers, I talk about helping every dad to be the best dad he can be. When I talk about health, I talk about helping men live long, happy, healthy lives. When I talk about safety, this is really interesting, safety. Go on Google, I don't think it still does it. I came up with this phrase, keeping men and boys safe. I didn't want to do the kind of like, stopping men being violent. I wanted to broaden it and try and change the thinking around it, not to deny men's violence or to exclude people who work in there, but to think about, hang on, if a bloke's being violent, he's not safe. He's not safe to himself, he's not safe to others. So I came up with this phrase, keeping men and boys safe. I Googled it to see if anyone else was using it, and Google said, do you mean keeping women safe? And doesn't that just point to what's going on at a cultural level, right? What do you mean keeping men and boys safe? Are you mad? They're the cause of all the problems. So, and then anything to do with boys. So I've got these sort of 2 maps that sort of map onto each other. So we've got these 4 areas of men's work, and obviously health's really broad, yeah. Physical, mental, sexual, spiritual, all the rest of it. Emotional well-being, social well-being, and then these. Are people working on a one-to-one basis? Are they working at a community basis? Or are they working at a strategic basis? So I find out, so where do they all fit together? And what I do as well is I didn't just do this at a city level. I went, right, wouldn't it be really amazing if I can find I mapped it out to a national level and an international level. So how can I find the best, what I'm up to in the world is finding the best person in all those fields in the world, and what a network that would be. And quite a lot of them are located in this country, so it's bloody great to be here. We've got 1 or 2 in our country too, Let's not be competitive about this, right? No, let's be competitive about this. I can see Julian watching me going, don't mention the cricket again, Glenn, don't mention the cricket again. So back to the 3 elements. So the groups, so at group level, and again, it's been diverse, right? It's not just going, there's only one. I've had people go, if you're working with men, you must have 2 trained therapists in the room, and no one else must be allowed to. Oh, yes. So. Therapeutic support groups, learning groups, like we do, we do a 9-week course for dads, but community groups in schools. We've got some great guys in our city who go into schools and form a group with the new dads, and they form a bond. And the school feed back and say, do you know, we've never had dads so involved in school because you did a 6-week program at the beginning, which was just for dads. So these little things have a knock-on and ripple effect. We think, oh, well, you just did a 6-week course with dads. No, you built a community in that school, which is having an impact for years to come. So groups are really, really powerful. We're never really aware of the ripples. I'm being really amazed by the men's well-being guys here. I keep coming across guys having amazing conversations and going, wow, you're an amazing guy. Where are you from? Oh, I'm with men's well-being. So you've got this community of guys, and individually, many of them are out doing stuff. That's really powerful stuff you guys do. You're generating yourselves by coming together in community and then going out and doing stuff. Really, really powerful. And then just really sort of simple social stuff. We found some of the most powerful stuff to get men engaged in the one-to-one stuff. It's just to have really simple community stuff where there is no pressure. There's nothing arranged. It's just a space. One of the themes that comes up about men's work over and over again, and it's never written in this language in the literature, but one of the barriers that men face to accessing services is they don't like people effing interfering with them. If you want to create a good project for men and boys, one of the key principles is let them do it themselves. So we create lots of spaces where men can just do it themselves with their kids, and they're delighted to have a couple of hours where they can spend some time with their kids without interference, without someone telling them what to do, without someone telling them that they're doing it wrong. And in those spaces, some of the conversations really take place. This unemployed, tattooed lad sidled up to me one time. He was early 30s. His son was 12, and he said to me, I can't write. I'd really like to learn to read and write because I can't read to my son, and I'm trying to get a job, and my missus is earning all the money, and I have to keep bothering her, helping me fill out the application forms. And he just wanted to be a protector and provider for his kid. And I was just like, I can't believe this guy. What a lovely guy, what a committed guy. He had the intention to be the best dad he could be. And he was still in the family after 12 years. How did that guy go through our city, through our system, for 12 years with no one picking up that he couldn't read and write, and he had a son that he wanted to read to, and not being able to read was preventing him from getting a job to provide for his son. It's bonkers. So in that sort of like little informal conversation, we're able then to push him in the right direction. A couple of examples of really good groups, because I'm interested in how do you replicate stuff. I'm so excited by how you guys replicate the Men's Sheds movement, how that's grown from the grassroots up. We've got a little one that's a little bit like that. It's a church-led group called Who Let the Dads Out, and they use church halls that already exist. There's 26,000 church playgroups in the UK, and there was only about 5 just for fathers. So they've actually just created a template, and then across the country now, loads are popping up. And Young Dads TV, this is a brilliant project. It connects young dads right across the country using social media. Because they did some research and found that young dads aren't connected to each other, they're not connected to services, and they're not connected to information. So they're building up this database of information that's recorded by these guys. They take them for a little workshop where they go, oh, right, I'm going to change my first nappy, and that information's all out there for other young dads to find. And bit by bit, they're building sort of self-regulating, self-running young fathers groups around the country. And two of these guys are in my city, and they're now on the advisory panel advising the government. And they're like, oh, wow, this guy here, Joe, he wasn't seeing his kids. His kids were going to be taken into care, because as is so often the case, mum's not able to do it, and they don't think of dad. In this case, the social workers worked with him so that he could look at, he's a single dad. He's a single dad. It was never going to happen but for a social worker taking a stand, and now he's advising the government on policy on young fathers. And that's because the one-to-one work, the community work, and the connection to the strategic network. And I just want to say very briefly, we can hold different perspectives in this kind of model, and I agree with you about the Quiet Revolution, and I heartily disagree with you about the Quiet Revolution at the same time, and this is an example of it. Joe was part of the Quiet Revolution, but also is part of the noisy revolution because it's getting his story heard at top level. And I think it's horses for courses. There's times when we need the noise, and there's times when we need the silent work. So finally, networks. It's like local networks. If you know people, they'll refer to you. If you've got practitioner networks, you can share good practice. You can train other practitioners in father-friendly stuff. If you're connected through support services, you know where to direct people. Soft policy networks, which I mean is just like you kind of know the people at a local level and able to take advantage of policy and get these little tweaks, a bit of funding there, a bit of funding elsewhere, but also the hard policy networks. We need campaigners, we need smart campaigners lobbying for change. And good practice network. This is an example of a good practice network. Here I am in the UK, learning about what you're doing in Australia and sharing a little bit of what we're doing. I do a list of 10 key barriers that men face to, this is all men face to services. It's all based on a load of, these aren't my ideas, it's taken from a load of research across social care, fathers work, mental health work, work with men around debt, all sorts of stuff, and I picked out the key themes. These are the 10 key themes, the 10 key barriers. It won't be relevant in all cases, but if you want to know what the barriers are, look at that list and see if one of those is in there for you. And barriers are really important, we think about the one-to-one work we do, but if you can remove a barrier, that enables a load of guys to suddenly get work. So that's the ultimate goal for me, building social capital, making sure that every man and boy everywhere in the world is just one conversation away from the help and support he needs. And there's a bit there on social capital. It's an interesting thing. I came up with the notion of male social capital. By male social capital, I mean an individual man or boy's ability to give help and get help. Is he just one conversation from the help and support he needs? And this is a more kind of like health work-based definition of social capital from the UK. So think of the bonds, the bridges, and the links. Bonds are strong personal connections. Bridges link you to other communities, other organizations. And links are sort of hierarchical. Can you make connections up and down? Do you have social mobility? Can you make connections up and down? So it's important for you as a practitioner to have those. Really important for an individual man or boy to have those if he's ever to get the help he needs. That's an example of a social worker in the UK who's been breaking down the barriers within his social work practice. He did his PhD and came to a realization that he'd been anti-male all his career and took on addressing that, owning it, and then put a system in place in his social service in Islington in London. That's what one of his social workers said about that work. Some of these examples are on my blog, Helping Men. I try and collect good practice and put it on a blog out in the public so people can see it. Sir Roger I nearly finished. Sir Roger Ollie up in the northeast of England. I love this guy. He had a service in the northeast. Only 8% of children's centre. Only 8% of users were dads. And he, in the space of about 6 months, he created a project called Dads Matter 2, and he had a serious gender equality issue. And that was that after that 4 to 6 months, more men were using the service than women. Proves what's possible when you remove barriers, and he got people just asking, "Where's Dad?" That's his book, worth looking at. It's got lots of practitioners' ideas from around the UK, engaging fathers in the early years. And there's Joe. Do it for Joe. I know that if I hadn't gone down to this, if I wasn't networked and connected, Joe wouldn't be where he is now. He's done it all himself, but if I hadn't created the network, there would have been no pathway for him to go from his local children's centre to me, to Young Dads TV, to the Prime Minister. So, he was able to be socially mobile because someone like me was prepared to make those links. You can do that for other people too. He's done all the work, but I made the path, and he found it. That's my book. Buy it. It's an ebook. It's really good. Okay.
I totally agree with Glen's observation that I came over here and had no idea how well developed the work in Australia is. And I know that sometimes when you're a prophet is never a prophet close to home, but you ought to realize that you're not just doing great work here in Australia, you are really leaders in the world. And so acknowledge yourselves, as Glen said. We're going to be looking today then at the two most vulnerable parts of the family, boys and fathers, and also recognizing that there's no way we can have decent relationships. Women don't fall in love with boys who are, with men who are adrift, with men who have no sense of purpose, with men who have no sense of mission, and with men who don't have their act together. And so if you don't have boys doing well, you don't have women marrying those young men, and you don't have, therefore you have children, a family without fathers, and you continue that cycle throughout generations. And that's what we're really dealing with today. And so I'll be looking at first an overview. I'll look at some of the evidence of why there really is a major boy crisis, why that boy crisis exists in all the industrialized world, that the industrialized world has in common, that success allowed there to be divorces, and divorces allowed there to be the options of people going separate ways, and then that led to children not having their fathers involved to a much greater degree all around the world. And so wherever we see this, we see a boy crisis. We'll look also then both at the evidence and then at causes and solutions. I'll be looking at, as the evidence, I'll look at education with you, why boys' IQs, or the evidence of boys' IQs dropping, careers and jobs, what's happening, physical health, what's happening there, mental health. We'll be looking at the 10 major, I'll only be able to share today with you a few, the first 3 of the 10 causes of the boy crisis, but I want to give you a sense that we're going to be dealing only with 3 of 10, and so here's the larger picture of what the 10 are. I'll be dealing first with the purpose void, secondly with video game addiction, third with fatherlessness, fourth with plastics and pollutants. I will not have a chance to deal with that, but I'll be happy to answer questions about that. ADHD and why the approach that we're taking today to ADHD is not an effective one. I'll be dealing with low HI, which I would call health intelligence, which is both physical health and mental health, and just social emotional skills. Number 7, career transition from muscle to mental, why the entire economy worldwide is changing from jobs that were boy-friendly to jobs that are much more female-friendly, or at least neutral. Looking at the perfect storm between sex, women, and porn. I began a little bit of that process yesterday in response to the question about sexuality. Number 9 is the disconnect between our sons and our schools. That disconnect is enormous and much more subtle than has been pointed out before. And then the self-fulfilling area of girls rule and boys drool, and why that is creating a major self-esteem problem among boys. So we're at the point now where we are looking at the issue of, let me just not distract you for a moment there. We're at the point now where publications like The Atlantic and New York Times Magazine are writing articles like that are called The End of Men. And there's a lot of good evidence to make that point. But if our sons see the end of men as their future, they'll basically have little inspiration for life's journey. And yet, when we talk to teachers and we talk to parents, in fact, we see an enormous lack of motivation among boys, what might be called a failure to launch. And that, of course, does create and reflects little inspiration for life's journey. So let's look at some of the evidence behind that. The consequences of that, before I get into the evidence, the consequences are enormous because males constitute our most constructive energy and our most destructive energy. In the most constructive energy, we tend to be the inventors, we tend to be the CEOs. Our most destructive energy, we tend to be the prisoners, we tend to be the serial killers. If we don't focus on working effectively with our sons, we are talking about a major release of destructive energy. This is, for the first time in American history, what I will do is I'll give some data. I always talk about what I know best, try to avoid things that I haven't researched as well. So because the boy crisis is a worldwide crisis, I'll be looking at some of the US data that I know best. I'll ask at the end for you to add some Australian data that you know best. But I will say that to the degree that I have research data worldwide, it's amazing how in industrialized countries there are very similar findings. For the first time in American history, our sons will have less education than their dads. If you have really good eyes, you'll see that Australia is number 13. Australia will have 6% more of our sons graduating from college than their fathers did. So at least you're not down there where the United States is at the bottom. We're 31 out of 31. You can look at, in looking at the differences in college degrees, what you see here is 61% it was in 1970 or so, 69, 61% of the people that graduated from college were males. Now it's projected that in 2019 that's going to be 39%. So the male and the female trajectory have gone in totally different ways. And yet we're still giving scholarships predominantly, at least in the United States, to girls and to women with the thought that they are the minority group that needs the extra help and not paying attention equally to the boys and to men. One of the amazing things is that boys' IQs have dropped about 15 points since the 1980s. And this is more surprising than it appears because from generation to generation, IQs usually increase. That is true with girls, but with boys, the opposite has happened. Boys who are nearly 12 years old today are doing only as well as 8 to 9-year-olds in the 70s. And girls don't have a history of liking boys who don't perform. And so this boys are stupid, throw rocks at them is not just an isolated book, it's an entire industry that has done extremely well selling sweatshirts and T-shirts and baseball caps and doing videos and so on, all focused on the theme, boys are stupid, throw rocks at them. From a mental health perspective, we, as boys and girls are at the age of 9, girls and boys' suicide rates are the same. But from age 10 to 14, boys' suicide rate becomes twice as high as girls. From 15 to 19, 4 times as high. From 20 to 24, more than 5 times, almost 6 times as high as girls. A CBS investigation found that more U.S. military were killed by suicide in 1 year than were killed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. Many of you caught a little bit of what I said yesterday about boys, when I wrote The Myth of Male Power, I subtitled it, Why Men Are the Disposable Sex. And disposability is not only a fact, it's a mindset of not taking care of the boys and men who sacrifice themselves once they've done their job of risking their lives. In 1920, American boys and men lived, in terms of physical health, American boys and men lived just 1 year less than women. American boys and men today live 5 fewer years. And so in just 90 years, the male-female life expectancy gap has grown 400%. Boys today, in terms of physical health again, have sperm counts that are less than half of what their grandfathers had at their age. Looking at the issue worldwide, the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, found that girls now outperform boys in overall educational markers in all 35 of the most developed countries. That includes Australia, England, US, Canada, Germany, France, and Japan. Let's look at some of the 3 of the causes of the boy crisis that I'll have a chance to focus on. One is the purpose void. I mentioned a second ago that virtually every society that survived did so by preparing its sons to be disposable. Disposable in war or disposable in work, and because many of our sons who die in war or work are dads, disposable as dads. The good news is that fewer men are needed as heroes today to die in war. And being a sole breadwinner no longer defines masculinity as it used to. That's the good news. The bad news is that disposability used to be a source of purpose. You'd go to war and you'd become a hero. So you had a mission, you had a purpose, you had dragons to kill. But disposability as purpose is being replaced for boys with no purpose. In contrast, when women lost their sense of purpose as homemakers and moms only, the women's movement sold them careers as an alternative sense of purpose, and then also made it legal and worked with laws and socialization and school systems at every dimension of society to inspire girls to have an alternative sense of purpose that would be relevant to the industrialized revolution. As a solution, developing new senses of purpose for our boys has to be part of every rite of passage. I believe being a dad as a new sense of purpose, working in what's now called women's professions, being tech warriors like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, inventors of better forms of communication. As I mentioned yesterday, if we are not going to be the sole breadwinners and we are not going to be the heroes, we have to have other things that we contribute to the family. And one of those things that we can contribute to the family is really knowing how to listen, knowing how to be effective in our communication, knowing how to have emotional intelligence rather than just technological intelligence. Although technological intelligence, believe me, as I'm doing this, is very helpful. Cause number 2, video game addiction. The problem, I want to make it clear, is not video games. The problem is our video game addiction. Just for anyone that's into video games, the data now shows us that video games are conducive to, they can be made so they're conducive to uniting the family. They can create friendships. They can be helpful for careers. They can develop spatial skills. They can develop increase ability to make good decisions. They can increase brain functions. And almost all playing of video games reduces stress. So the problem is not video games. The problem is video game addiction. If I were to compare video games to one thing, it would be to red wine. Some people can't touch red wine without becoming addicted. Other people can do it in moderation, and it ends up being healthy for them. And everybody, once it becomes too much for them, based on their level of handling it, become addicted, and that's the problem. And here is the problem with boys versus girls. Teenage boys use video games an average of 13 hours a week. Teenage girls use them an average of 5 hours a week. And this doesn't include the viewing of pornography, the watching of sports on a mobile device. It's just video games. It's when you get to the 13-hour per week level that you move into probable addiction for many boys. Brain images of boys playing video games find the games can affect the brain once it moves to the addiction level in a way that's similar to cocaine, Ritalin, Adderall, and Concerta. And all of those drugs operate a lot like cocaine on the brain. The key issue is that there's two parts of the brain that are really impacted by video games. One, and video games motivate you, as I'll explain in a moment, to win at the game. But they don't motivate you to win at life, and here's why. Here's the brain part of the brain that's relevant. There's the nucleus accumbens, which is right there. And the nucleus accumbens is what gets filled up, blood, when you're playing a video game, blood engorges in the nucleus accumbens, and dopamine increases, motivating you to win at the actual video game. But what happens is that blood is prevented from going into the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is what is necessary to translate motivation into real life skills. So a boy who's really good at playing NFL Madden football will be usually unable to play football itself. He just is a winner at the game of football, but he doesn't even necessarily know how to throw a football. And there's an enormous inverse relationship between success in the game and success at life. This is not true at the 5, 6, 7 hour a week level. It is true at the addiction level. So that's why the issue is not video games, but video game addiction. By the age of 21, boys average 14,000 hours of gaming. It only takes about a third of that time to get a bachelor's degree. A bachelor's degree takes about 4,800 hours, including homework. The solution is video games in moderation, basically. And the solution to video games in moderation is parental boundary enforcement. One of the single most important contributions of fathers is boundary enforcement. Not boundary setting, mothers are more likely to do that, but boundary enforcement. So let's get into cause number 3, fatherlessness. Here's on the Dallas area, rapid transit, that's public transit in Dallas, Texas. This is a billboard that was featured there. One day, my husband will kill me. Observe, it doesn't say one day my husband might kill me. It says one day my husband will kill me. Understand that this billboard was being paid for by public monies. Another billboard, dart number 2, when I grow up, I will beat my wife. Now let's take a look at this for a moment. This is the image of boys who have the potential for becoming fathers. Imagine taking your daughter or son for a walk in Dallas and seeing a billboard like this. Your son is 6, 7, or 8 years of age. There's a lot of subtle things in this billboard. For example, the billboard features a white boy. Why a white boy, even though the girl is African American? Consider, for example, a black boy saying, when I grow up, I'll beat my wife. Immediately, if we saw that with a black boy, the focus would be on the racism. The racism of showing a black boy saying, I will beat my wife would have been so apparent, but yet we're blind to the misandry, so blind to the misandry that few people even know that the word misandry means hate men, the hatred of men, just like misogyny means the hatred of women. We're so blind to the misandry that multiple layers of city employees in Dallas either unconsciously approved, distributed, and hung these billboards, or consciously approved of using city funding to help finance this. In effect, the spreading of negative feelings about our sons not as a potential perpetrator, but as an inevitable perpetrator. When I grow up, I will beat my wife, is taxpayer-supported misandry. What's powerful for me is not the existence of these billboards, but what's powerful is the multiple layers of public employees that did not question this before this got to the billboard level on buses, where literally millions of people were calculated to have seen these billboards. Let's look at what's missing when dad's missing. The most important thing is as we've been talking about here, is what I call a dad-rich family. I'd like us to think of a family that has a dad involved in it, as being dad-rich. So we begin to introduce into our vocabulary that what we as men produce is not money that makes the family rich, but rather our emotional connection with the family that makes a family dad-rich. The more dad-rich a family is, the better a child does in more than 30 areas of measurement. Those areas are social, psychological, physical health, and academic. The most important factor by far in preventing drug use is a close relationship with dad. When studies were done, a meta-analysis of all the major studies on dads in non-intact families spending more time with their children versus having more money to give to their children and families, it was found that in a non-intact family, time with dad helps a child's well-being more than money from dad. Boys who live with their fathers after divorce tend to be warmer, counterintuitive. We usually think of mothers as being warmer, and mothers probably are warmer, but that doesn't mean that the children are warmer. Have a higher degree of self-esteem, be more mature, and be more independent than boys who don't. Worldwide, the amount of time a father spends with a child is one of the strongest predictors of empathy in adulthood. Any one of these items that I just mentioned and the other 30 major areas of measurement have enormous implications for our future. But just think about empathy in relation to what the topic here is today of family relationships. Have you ever heard someone say, "I want a divorce. My partner understands me"? One issue, just being understood. I mean, we don't divorce our dogs, they understand us, or at least they don't question us. But just the feeling that we're being empathized with and not criticized or controlled and so on is probably a single most powerful thing. And the United States is an enormous litigious culture, but very seldom does anybody sue anybody else from whom they feel empathy or sue anybody toward whom they feel empathy. What I'm suggesting really would put an enormous amount of lawyers out of work. Looking at the issue of why fathers can create a new male sense of purpose. In the past, boys fulfilled their sense of purpose and mission via careers that lasted a lifetime. In the future, careers will rarely last a lifetime. It is preparing our son to be a dad that will give him a sense of purpose for a lifetime. However, boys will not be inspired to pursue the option of being a great father in a culture of father absence. Desire to be a father begins in the son, who sees in his own dad who he could become. We have, though, a culture of father absence. For the first time in U.S. history, and I understand the data is fairly similar in Australia, more than 50% of children born to mothers under 30 were born outside marriage. When a child is born to a mother who is not married, very rarely does that child have a lot of access to the father. What access she or he does have to the father tends to be conditional on the mother believing that the father is behaving the way she believes a father should father. And so therefore, the relationship of the father to the mother becomes hierarchical in a family where there's no, where the child is born outside of marriage. The father has to sort of is an advisor to the mother. He has to have permission from the mother, and the mother judges and gatekeeps what the father is doing. So therefore, there isn't what is really needed in the family. The families that do best have a checks and balances where there's often tension between the mother and the father. The mother says, no, the child shouldn't climb the tree. The father says it's okay to climb the tree. And the argument about whether the child can climb the tree or not leads to the child climbing fewer portions of that tree, and yet being able to climb that tree and being watched out more carefully. So the protection from the mother and the encouragement of risk-taking for the father is much more likely to occur when the father and the mother have an equal balance of power and equal checks and balances with each other. One out of every 3 children in America lives in father-absent homes. That's 24 million American children living without a dad. Take a look at this part here. This is the increase of just since the 1980-something, or about 1990. It was 34% of women who were under 30 had children outside of marriage. Today it's 53% of all women, including women over 30. It went from 4% in 1940 to 41% today, or a few years ago. 2 examples of an important question is, what is the uniqueness of a dad's contributions? There are so many areas that one of the real problems with fathers and mothers and fathers not being more involved is that dads do not know what we do that contributes to the family. We don't read books on it, we don't study it, we don't make it a part of our life learning experience. And so therefore it's impossible for us to, if we don't know what we contribute, it's impossible for us to talk to moms about the value of our contribution. And women can't be blamed for not hearing what men don't say. So we have to take the primary responsibility of educating ourselves to communicate about not just what we do, but the value of what we do. So, for example, roughhousing, coaching, and play, which fathers tend to do, create a bond of dad and child against the other team. Thank you. The child becomes receptive to criticism from the dad because the child perceives the dad as helping him or her become a winner against the adversary. Without that bond, the mother and the teacher not having that bond, but often teaching directly, but not having done the play, not having created the excitement, not having done the roughhousing, don't have that bond. And so oftentimes the child's relationship to a teacher becomes more rebellious. The child's relationship to the mother becomes more manipulative and coercive. But the child doesn't want to lose the bond of that play and that roughhousing and that chasing each other, where the father has often created in the process of coaching. We see this in the most successful school that has been set up in the United States that I'm aware of, in Bedford-Stuy, one of the poorest communities in the United States. A teacher named Jay Nondal, he became a principal, started a charter school. The first 3 hours of that charter school were focused on sports, and 3 hours for troubled children, sports were the focus. Those children went from 0% likelihood of going to college to 95% went to college. But it's not just because of the sports starting the day, it was because the coach stayed with the child and tapped in with the child all day long. The connection between that and fathers is, we don't just need fathers to be visitors there occasionally, we need fathers to be involved with their children all the time. That the coaching has to be, you have to move from the leverage that you create with the bond with the child and use that leverage to continue to be involved with the children. So when mothers and fathers are divorced, they need to live close to each other so the father and the mother can both be involved and continue that coaching with the child. But especially the father involvement is crucial for these positive outcomes. To the degree that a dad plays sole breadwinner, one of dad's contributions is One of the other contributions that dads have besides the coaching is boundary enforcement. And let me explain what I mean by that. Moms are very much more likely than dads to say, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. Dads are almost as likely as moms to say that too. The difference between dads and moms is that when the child, who's always will set the boundaries with either the father, test the boundaries with either the father or the mother, the mom is much more likely to say, I'm not going to get into a big argument over a few peas. So the child has just told me it had a few more peas, but it didn't finish all the peas, and so I'll let the child have the ice cream without finishing the peas, because after all, he did try hard, or she tried hard. The father looks at the child and says, excuse me, we had a deal here. The deal was, you finish the peas, then you can have the ice cream. You don't finish, you can choose not to finish the peas, but don't even look at me for the ice cream. And the child goes, you are so mean, Mom lets me have the peas. That's fine, that's the rules of Mom's house. By the way, if you continue crying, there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. So the child learns from the father that if I continue whining and complaining, I'm not going to be a winner. I'm going to be a loser. The child learns from the mother that I can almost always manipulate a better deal. The child knows that the mom's going to be pretty exhausted, and it's all it has to do is exhaust the mom a little bit more, and the mom will be saying to herself, I'm not going to get into a big argument over a few peas. The child's got a good point about how sensitive, and I want to be sensitive to his or her needs, but the child then learns, is twice as likely when raised by a mom to be ADHD as she is or he is to be ADHD when raised by a dad. And one of the reasons for that is the child is learning to focus on doing what it has to do, finish the peas, in order to get the ice cream, and is therefore learning postponed gratification. Postponed gratification is a key to being able to succeed in life. Those are a few just brief examples of the way fathers contribute that almost no father articulates to anybody. And unless we know that, we can't expect people to respect us. And that's what we have to get out there, not just with the importance of fathers, but people have to know not just why dads are important. They have to know that they're important and for the reasons that are important, and what we do is helpful. To conclude, the father's catch-22 is that dads learn to love their family by being away from the love of their family, by being at work. But the more successful we become at work, the less successful we tend to be in love. Good attorneys tend to find fault. Good husbands tend to find appreciation. The Pew Research data shows that more than half of dads are saying, I'd prefer to be home rather than to be with my children. These are full-time working dads that are surveyed. First time in history that question was asked of dads in that way. In the past, mothers learned to row the family boat from the right side, raise children. Fathers only from the left side, raise money. Today, mothers can row from both sides, but fathers still get the most respect only when they row only from the left, raising money. The problem, if a mom wants or needs to row from the left side of the boat, and a dad could only row from the left, the boat goes in circles. In the future, advanced technologies are going to make it clear that economic change is the only constant, increasing the need for a family boat that has flexibility. With our sons eventually able to raise children as comfortably as our daughters are now raising money. In the future, we don't need a women's movement blaming men, nor do we need a men's movement blaming women. We need a gender transition movement helping both sexes go from the rigid roles of the past to more flexible roles for our future. We need to do for our sons what we've done for our daughters, so our daughters will have men who are worthy of their love. Thanks.
The first question is just following on from the fatherlessness stuff, which using Glen's expression, I fully agree with the statistics and the ideas. Sometimes the conclusions I get always a bit concerned about, because when I look at who uses a fatherlessness position, it's often tinged with a very strong, even religious background. It's about bringing back Judeo-Christian hierarchy within society. It's about abolishing the family law court. It's about bringing fault back into divorce and men being back the head of the family. How do you deal with that tension around the whole fatherlessness statistics and conclusions when they can get so easily hijacked by many rogue issues and causes?
I think it's a great question, and it goes to the heart of the problem, which is we need to go beyond the binary, and we need to be able to hold both. We need to hold, like Warren was describing about the value of the mother and the father in that dynamic. And we know that's not rigid, even though there's flexibility around that, but there's two positions which both serve each other. We need to do that. It is true that when fathers aren't around, generally, not specifically, I think that's a really good phrase to use. Doesn't mean to say that every single child who doesn't have a father is going to do worse than the child next door that does have a father, really. But generally, not specifically, children do worse when dads aren't involved. And that's just, it's a fact. And then we also need to be caring and mindful of the fact that not everyone has a father around. So it's not saying, we're not saying children do better when fathers are around, therefore every single couple should be married and sit together forever. We're just saying they do better, and therefore we need to be mindful of that.
Yeah, and I think, first of all, we should never fear taking a position because somebody we disagree with about other issues agrees with us on that area. So, but most born-again Christians, most very strong people that say the father should be the head of the family, they also want their sons and their daughters to be empathetic. They want their children to do well in school. And the issue is not the father being the head of the family. The issue is there being checks and balances in the family so that both the father and the mother understand that the tension between the two of them, the arguments that they have, are actually often very useful arguments. They're arguments that if neither parent dominates and both parents hear each other, which gets back to the communication issue that I talked about yesterday, which is a huge additional need. If parents are communicating effectively when they're either together or respect each other when they're divorced, which means if they're divorced, there has to be three things that happen that I think almost every conservative and every liberal would agree with, because if they understand the outcome. If you want children after divorce to do almost as well as children will do in an intact family, three things need to occur. The children need to have about an equal amount of time with the mother or the father. Otherwise, the mother's system of parenting dominates the father's, or the father's dominates the mother's. Secondly, you have to have the children, the mother and father, live close enough to each other so that the children don't have to give up activities or friendships to see the other parent that's farther away. Then the children end up resenting seeing the other parent that is the non-primary parent. And third, the child needs to hear and see very little bad-mouthing from mom to dad or dad to mom. And so and if those three things are intact in a non-intact family, the child, at least girl and boy children, by the way, have a much better chance of doing very well. And like Glenn said, I compare a child without a dad as somebody that goes from Perth to Sydney by car, drunk. They're likely to get there without getting into a major accident, but you're certainly increasing the chances of a bad experience.
Gary Marson here. One really question to you. I was actually a bit surprised at your very last statement. You were talking about parenting, but then you said at the end that something to the effect that men will become people that women would want to love. And that suggests to me that unless men become more like women, that they're not deserving of love, and yet men have a whole range of attributes which are deserving of love. The way they interact with people in general is because they're wired differently, and so that is reflected in the way they behave with their children. And you've already said that there are a whole lot of great attributes and a whole lot of deficits that occur when they don't interact in the way that dads should interact. But and then you have, towards the end, you were talking about the vote on the left and the right. But I mean, you're on the one hand you're saying, well, women can do whatever they like, but unless men do more like women, then they don't deserve the love that from a woman, and therefore things won't work out.
Yeah, good point, Gary. Let me clarify that. I actually wrote something more complex than that, but because I realized I was running over on time, I shortchanged it, and you were bright and sharp enough to pick up the distinction. So when men are successful, they are more their marriages are likely to last much longer. Women are very interested in being married to and remaining married to men who are successful. However, there's a distinction between marriages that last and a woman who is happy. The process that it takes to become successful at work is in tension with the process that it takes to be successful in love. Meaning that if I'm a good attorney, and you, and Gary down here is my opponent, and I'm representing Glen, and if I'm a really good attorney, every time Gary speaks, I'm forming in my own mind's eye a flaw in Gary's argument, and I'm beginning to build up that argument and watch for the first opportunity to interrupt Gary. And if I do that, I may have succeed for Glen as an attorney, but if I take that same skill set, very well refined, home, and every time my wife talks, I listen to her for a couple of seconds, pick up the gist of what she's saying, self-listen, and then interrupt her and so on, the chances are fairly good she'll stay with me because I'm successful, but she won't feel loved by me. And so one of the things that I think it's really important for, one of the things that women have and female energy have to offer us is that as we as men do not become the primary breadwinners, women will look for us, to us for things other than money, which I think is great. And so we need to learn emotional communication skills that were not necessary when we were willing to die and be disposable in war and be heroes that were not, or when we are sort of making a great deal of money and the woman stays with us for that reason and forms women friends. So I'm saying we have a whole new set of things to offer. Women are moving into, we are now beginning to value and want women to earn more. We know most men today are not okay with a woman who wants to spend all day at home. So there's a lot of possibility of flexibility of roles, and in that process of developing deeper emotional skills, I think that we're likely to, the blessing on that, in that process, is that love has the potential for being really deep in between men and women, rather than men and women just using each other.
Can I just a follow-up point as well, which is, and I really hear the making men more like women, and it's really, for me, it's really not about that. It's about helping human beings be better at getting along together and working in the world we have now. This is the world we have now, and I think we need to equip our sons to live in the world we have now, so that they can be successful in life, in all areas of life. In all areas of life, and the areas of life that are most important to them, and that can be being muscular and sporting, and and being physical, and having an outdoor profession, and it can be loving and caring and nurturing. It's choices are open to us, and it's really not an either or. And actually, the relational skill, that's not a woman's skill. Men can do relationship too, and it's just about us helping boys to develop into relational beings, without throwing out all the other stuff as well. Actually acknowledging what's great and unique and different about boys, and being aware of areas where they can develop and grow. Because when they've got those relational and communication skills, where we as men have got more of those relational and communication skills, then we can make the case for what's good and needed about men and the importance of men in the world of men's work and working with fathers and championing dads and what dads bring and all the rest of it.
It's an observation, both Glen and Warren, in relation to stereotyping, and Glen touched on it with the father of the mummified child, and he wasn't to be believed in court, so it wasn't followed up. Warren, you touched on it with the two billboards. the stereotypical male and that sort of thing. My observations in the last probably 10 years I've been at a university is that stereotypical beliefs and that become perceptions for other people, that they then become false truths, and then there's a whole social misunderstanding based on those things, and we certainly see it here in Australia in relation to family violence. I never knew what family violence was until I went to university, and I never saw it. Didn't even know what it was, and then all of a sudden here I am, a potential abusive husband, father, whatever the case may be. And it's been very, very hard to get that sort of truth, mistruth, whatever you want to call it, to be pulled apart and examined. It's just like your thoughts and comments in that from two people coming from two different countries to a third country. Thank you.
Yeah, great question. I think, firstly, we see the same thing in the UK, and I'm sure Warren will, he'll let you know what it's like in the States. So what Warren said was, hey, look, that billboard, if it was a black guy, would say it was racist, and we're blind to the sexism. We're blind to the sexism against men and boys. We're blind to the misandry. So we don't have to argue against or fight against all this great stuff that's been done to tackle homophobia, to tackle sexism against women, to tackle racism. We don't have to be against all of that. We can stand alongside that and say, and. I want to give you one of the most powerful words in the English language, and, okay, rather than but. You know, if you say, there's all this stuff about, you know, sexism against women and racism, the gay guys and all the rest of it, but what about the guys? Try and. There's all that stuff, and we also need to be mindful of this. It's just a continuation of that value set to try and include everyone. They are blind to it. They're blind to it. People are blind to it. So that's one part. And the other part is to recognise how things are changing and shifting. So this dialogue is changing and shifting. We've got to get away from the binary. We've got to be inclusive. We can't just have a sort of essentially a pro-feminist and an anti-feminist argument. We need an inclusive argument that goes beyond that and acknowledges the bits of all that, the pro-feminist dialogue, which is completely relevant, and also then fill in the gaps where that's missing. And a big part of that is the work that we do, right? We don't have to be anti-feminist to do that. We can help fill in the gaps beyond that. We don't have to be pro-feminist either, by the way. You know, you have choices. And I'm observing how that's emerging. And I'm seeing in the domestic violence field that what's emerging is now a diversity where non-feminist voices are coming through, where men's organisations are taking responsibility for the issues that men face, as opposed to attacking the other side. Over here, you've got the 1 in 3 campaign, which is one of the best advocacy campaigns for male victims of domestic violence. Over in the UK, we've got an organisation called Abused Men in Scotland, which is doing awesome work helping male victims of domestic violence from a non-feminist perspective. So we've got to be aware as an international network what's working to actually create a new narrative which allows for both, using the word and.
I want to pick up that point and connect it back to Gary Mison's question too, about I think it's really important that we not as men be afraid of learning from women and women's traditional modalities, but it's also part of what I was saying when I was saying that men were really good at coaching and playing physically and creating excitement. It's also important for women to learn from men. And men and women can really do that well. So for example, in the school that I briefly was referring to, which is Urban Dove School in Bedford-Stuyvesant, the teachers are both male and female teachers, but they play with kids the way, normally speaking, men tend to play with kids. Lots of competition, but also yoga, many different types of physical activities are encouraged for 3 solid hours during the day, and then there's the transfer of that coaching mentality and that bond over to coaching against the adversaries of life that the child can't deal with. That seems to be such a magical combination. That is something that dads tend to do fairly naturally, along with boundary enforcement, from which women can learn from men. But when we have a hierarchical structure of saying that the woman has the child outside of marriage and she lets the father in, if the father behaves like she feels a father should behave, and we fathers haven't educated ourselves as to the value of things that we contribute, and we can't even make an argument, no less have equal amounts of power, that's when problems occur. So what we are about, I believe, evolving toward, the best part of what we're evolving toward is both sexes learning from each other's traditional roles and integrating the best. But the dialogue has to occur through knowledge. We have to know that domestic violence is a two-way street. We have to know that, yes, men are more violent outside of the home, and no, they are not more violent inside of the home. Inside of the home, more than 300 studies have been shown that men and women are about equally violent toward each other. And here are the reasons. And beyond the reasons of equality, there is a way to stop domestic violence. And the way to stop domestic violence is very powerful communication training, like I began to refer to yesterday, about knowing how to handle personal criticism without becoming defensive. When people have that training at an early age or even at a later age and it's practiced consistently, domestic violence, it decreases. But we need to work politically with people who believe they don't even want to hear that domestic violence is a two-way street. And so we have to be strong enough politically to be able to get that point heard and to go around people who are so ideologically fixed that they're unable to hear that. But in order to do that, the universities have to be confronted. And as long as universities have adopted a Marxist point of view toward feminism and gender roles, which is oppressor versus oppressed, we won't have an opportunity to change the system to an understanding of how the genders are not about oppressor and oppressed, that Marxism and civil rights are false models for male-female relationships in which both sexes sacrifice differently for each other. That needs to be confronted. How do we confront that? We need activists who are willing to sue universities. Because if you don't sue universities for equality, universities cannot respond. I played tennis with the president of Northwestern University in Chicago, and afterwards he didn't know who I was and I didn't know who he was. We finished the game and we said, we shared what we were about, and he said, man, that is just, men's issues never even occurred to me. And I said, do you want to be the first university in the world to really have a sophisticated men's issues program? And without skipping a beat, he said, Warren, I'd be killed within 2 weeks by the feminists. And I said, well, what could I do? What could make that happen? And he said, you'd have to have students at the university sue me for the program, and then I would become the hero by helping the university not be sued. So it didn't take him but a minute to come to that conclusion. And so people like the work that Glen has been doing with Fathers for Justice, we need people at every end of the spectrum. Activists who are willing to take the risks and make noise. We need people who are quiet, loving, and communicative. And we need everybody in between. We have to all work together to create an outcome of greater love.
Yeah, yeah. Hear, hear.
Doing some research in separated families and parenting for mums and dads, and one of your key factors you talk about is having both parents involved, even moving close to each other in that situation. What I read in some research was that that's more likely to occur if the father has the custody, if you like, of the children, to have the mother involved in their lives and the other way around. Have you? Can you comment on that?
Yes, when I did the research for Father and Child Reunion, I found out that what you said is, Tim, is accurate. And here's why. When the father is the primary parent, the father is usually wanting the mother to be involved. That's number one. Number two, the mother very much wants to remain involved. Very few mothers will leave their children and be uninvolved with their children. And so the father and the mother work together to keep the mother involved when the father is the primary parent. When the mother is the primary parent, the mother is far more likely to do gatekeeping and bad-mouthing. Those two things are very well documented on about a 5-to-1 level. And so but it's the gatekeeping that actually keeps the fathers away more than the bad-mouthing. The gatekeeping means that, and from the mother's point of view, to defend the mothers here for a bit, the mothers are feeling like, gee, I took my child over to Dad's on Saturday, and Dad took the child to the playground, and the child came back from the playground. He got into a fight. Where was Dad? He was home watching rugby or football or whatever, but he cares more about football than he does about the child. But from the father's point of view, it's crucial that that child had a chance to be at the playground by himself or herself, and that if they got into a fight, he wants the child to get into a fight when she or he is young enough to be able to process how to avoid fights in the future while the child is still a child. He doesn't want to overprotect the child from interaction with other people to such a degree that that fights don't occur, but on the other hand, life doesn't get learned at an early age. And so by not communicating his intent to the mom, or by having only visitation where the child, just after being beaten up, gets picked up by the mom and goes back to the mom's home, and the mom experiences it through the child's eyes without having the processing take place with the father. That's the type of thing that happens when the child does not have time with the father. So the summary of all that is that children who live primarily with dads do better than children who live primarily with moms after divorce. But that's not because men are better fathers than women are mothers, but it's largely because men, because of the type of dynamics I just described, when a dad is the primary parent, it's more like an intact family where both sexes are involved about equally. When the mom is the primary parent, if she does gatekeeping, the gatekeeping tends to make the dad feel without purpose, like a babysitter. He then goes off and finds another woman who has children, begins to get involved, sees more love in his future with another woman with the children, gets more involved with that family, and begins to neglect his biological children. So that's the dynamic that often happens when after divorce that leads to those outcomes.
Two distinctions to give you. Firstly is to understand why that happens, to add another layer. Intact family, traditional roles, mum's there all the time, dad goes in and out. So it seems much easier and more natural when you're separated for mum to be there all the time and to dad go in and out. So mum feels really challenged when she isn't there all the time because her traditional role is being challenged. There's a way beyond that, which isn't just about the stuff that Warren said, which I agree with, is that if you look at the trends around the world, there was some good research done across Europe about how likely are fathers to share parenting after divorce. So what we found is that in Sweden, fathers are 3 times more likely to share parenting than fathers in the UK. 3 times more likely, separated fathers. What the difference is there is that shared parenting is promoted from birth, and fathers are given close to, Iceland's the closest now, fathers are given close to equal rights and equal support from birth to be involved. So there's a culture from birth of sharing care, and that's in the modern world, one of the biggest protectors against fathers being removed after separation, because the culture of sharing care already exists.
G'day, Glenn and Warren. My name's Damien, at the back in the middle. It's more a couple of comments. Racism and homophobia are actually social determinants of health. I'm pretty sure misandry is not. I haven't come across a study that says as such. So I don't know if it's ready for that and yet. Warren, in your presentation, you had a graph up there around that spoke to marriage. I don't believe marriage to be a stabiliser of a good family. I think a good relationship is. And thirdly, those 2 chairs that are vacant, at the next one I'd like to see a gay father and an Indigenous father.
Great point. On the diversity, I completely and utterly agree with you.
Not diversity encourages otherness.
Okay, however you want to word it, but I agree with you on the end goal, right, which is a variety of perspectives. On the social determinants of health, I put up a book at the end called Equality for Men. There's loads of stuff in there which shows how male inequality and men's issues, it's a different language, but male inequality and men's and boys' issues are determinants of poor performance, poor health later in life. So it's worth looking at. We just haven't looked at it. And on the marriage side, I'll let you take that, Warren.
Yeah, when you don't recognize something like misandry, you don't do studies about it. And when you don't do studies about it, when you don't recognize it, it doesn't get funded. And almost all studies are done by universities where there's funding for something. But when we look to common sense rather than just sort of like a study per se, you see there's thousands and thousands of studies showing that when we have divorces and we have an attitude toward fathers that I do a lot of expert witness work to help fathers become involved with the children, but the people who get to me have to have a lot of money in order to handle the lawyers and people like me to pay us. And so there's millions of kids that really need fathers or who are much poorer. They're getting left out of that. Now, do we have hard data on what happens with families that don't have fathers involved? And we have enormous data on that. But does that logically, common sense-wise, come from an attitude toward men as dads? Yes, it does. And with your sort of more liberal perspective, you should be right on board that because you want, I'm sure, children to grow up healthy and well. And we need mothers and fathers communicating with each other. And just like, the reason I suppose the world's leading male feminist for 15, 20 years was because I wanted women to be respected. But as we began to accomplish that goal, I began to see there was a deficit occurring simultaneously, which was a lack of respect for men. And when you have things like books like Boys Are Stupid, Throw Rocks at Them, or those types of DART posters, and they go through systems, you can, if you had an understanding of what misandry was about, somebody would fund a study, measure things like that, and you'd have the findings you're looking for. But please don't be blind by the ideology of it's racism, it's sexism, you have the isms that are part of the political correct institutions, to also close your mind to another ism that is happening that is hurting all of us, just like racism is and just like sexism is. And it doesn't have to be a but, it needs to be an and, absolutely. Thank you.